Well, welcome back, Maurice. Welcome back, Emma.
Hi.
Yeah.
Good to see you again, Gary.
So, we had some fun last week. We had nearly 400 people tune in live, and they have given us over 35 outstanding questions. So we're not going to endeavor today to address all 35, but we are going to try and aggregate some and ask a few questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Maurice, I'm going to ask you the first question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Firstly, people are commending the fact that you're now taking on a ESG role, Maurice. Good man. And what do you believe are the next big steps that can improve on sustainability and environmental impact of data centers?
Okay, so I probably touched on this briefly on the original call, but there's a couple of ways of splitting this up from our point of view. We've got to look at our legacy infrastructure, the current footprint that we have, and we have to look at our new data center design and build, our data centers of the future. So if we look at our legacy infrastructure, there's a couple of very simple, quick wins for us around being much more efficient, reducing PUEs, looking at our supply chain into the data centers, and looking at our backup generation, policies in each of those sites, and where can we actually make a difference. Some of those sites are not that easy to, based on where they were built originally, based, the proximity to environments around them, it's not a huge amount that we can do. But I think that the encouraging thing is that we've set a plan about looking at all our legacy infrastructure to reduce the carbon footprint, reduce the energy usage, make them more efficient where we can, and set ourselves some significant goals around energy reduction globally. So that's kind of broadly speaking what we're doing on the legacy side of things. I think what's probably more exciting, if we look at our new data center design and build plans, that's where I think we can look at getting some significant gains. And there we're looking at, where do we actually locate our sites? How do we look at our energy procurement? How do we look at our supply chain into that new, our suppliers into that supply chain as conscious around the environment as we are? How do we look at our, the circular economy pieces around, waste, heat, and water usage efficiency? Where do we look at if we look at our energy usage, and we look at, I suppose, carbon footprint and carbon neutrality, what is our policy going to be around renewable energy contracts, or PPAs, and how do we look at that footprint going forward? And then how do we look at our backup generation? So we're doing some exciting stuff over in the US, where we've got a project starting next year on a hydrogen fuel cell down in Virginia. And that's going to be a pilot project for us. It's a 25 megawatt site. So we're looking at some decent projects across EMEA as well. So, there's lots of stuff going on. I mean, some of it's not ready to discuss, but I think we've got a very extensive program around the new DNC design. But again, for us, this is going to be a roadmap between 5 and 10 years to get to a position where we'd be completely, clean tech and 100% renewable across our global footprint.
A lot of what you said there is very in line with a lot of what societal change is going through, i.e. circular economy, reusing raw materials and stuff. So whilst there's never a great time to start or finish, it's not the worst time to be starting on this journey when more renewable energy is now cost viable. There's a greater sense of purpose around the money that's funding it. It's really interesting, but the narrative and the words you use are very akin to a lot of people I hear talking about circular economy. So thank you so much on that. Emma, welcome back from that kitchen of yours.
Thanks, Garry. It's good to be back.
Yeah.
And actually, it's nice because I was scribbling answers as fast as I could into those questions. So
Were
I think
you?
everyone deserves a more coherent response.
That's so wonderful. Thank you for that. So I'm going to ask you a question that came in and was asked very regularly. And I'll paraphrase it here, but data center predominant companies are, at the end of the day, data companies. They're hosting data in centers. Do you see where they become like mini power station energy centers? And if so, have you any exemplars, and what's the timeline on this? So if effectively you're not only going to be a baker, but you're going to be growing the corn also.
We're going to move to being generators. Yes and no is the answer. So I think what we're seeing here is it's a spectrum of stuff we can do in terms of energy procurement, and obviously we've got the same sort of energy trilemma as anyone else. It has to be accessible, it has to be affordable, it has to be sustainable. So we've got to work that. And I think what companies are doing is what they can. So if you are not in control of the energy bill, if you don't pay it, you have to offset. If you do buy the power, you can choose to buy certified renewables. For many people, that's not good enough, because that's essentially taking out of existing renewable supply, and we want to see additional utility scale renewable generation. So then you move to PPAs, which can be virtual power purchase agreements, where you're actually essentially funding a new utility scale generation project, renewable generation project, I should add. Then you get to the stage, which actually a lot of cloud providers are already doing, is moving to areas with available renewable generating supply, electricity supply. But the move that, Garry, you're talking about is a slightly different one, where actually you rather than siting yourself next to that, and we see a couple of examples in the UK where data centers are being invited to site themselves next to, say, energy from waste plants. What we're then looking at is how the data center can become essentially a prosumer in the energy landscape and part of that energy market. So in a sense, they're either working from fuel cells with top up from the grid, and then battery standby, which cannot be done yet because we don't have a market for hydrogen. So there's got to be a certain amount of pump priming for the supply of green hydrogen in a market, and battery storage. So those things are some way off. And otherwise, I suspect that it'll be some time before we see actually sort of essentially generation being invested in by the data center operators on site as part of the data center project. I think that's still a little bit of time off in the mainstream. But certainly we're seeing examples across that whole spectrum. Does that help, Garry?
It does, but it also, a bit like what I suggested to Maurice, was you use a lot of terms there that are again used as part of the smartening of grids. It's just that data centers are a particular active participant, like prosumers you used. Hydrogen, green hydrogen. You hear these when people are talking about the smartening of their grids. And it's coming now. This is the decade where that'll happen. So it's interesting that so much activity is going on in the data center space at the time when the grids themselves are looking to be more smart and prosumers. You also, which is a wonderful thing about you as a very educated person, gave me a new word. I never heard trilemma. I'm thinking that's when you've got three options. I didn't know that dilemma had a trilemma, so thank you.
Yeah, it's dilemma with an extra problem.
Or solution. It depends whether what way you're looking at it. So thank you.
Actually, you're right, Garry. Data centers are really well positioned to be prosumers in the energy landscape, but there are a number of market and technology barriers we've got to overcome.
Agreed. But this idea that sometimes is projected that somehow the industry is in denial of its role and responsibility. I guess it's all that so much is changing as we look towards a decarbonized society of whatever date that is what I think I'm hearing. Maurice, can I just...
Sorry, just on that point, I just think it's probably important to note that the stakeholders now across this area are quite broad, and you know, you've got your investor community, you've got your customers, employees, and the communities that we are located in, and every one of those has got an input into you know, the sustainability future, I think. And we commissioned a report quite recently with Gartner on sustainability within data centers, and you know, 89% of all the publicly quoted companies have sustainability as part of their, you know, forward-looking plans. The S&P 500, you know, 90% of those want to work with companies that have the same vision that they do around sustainability. And when you look at attracting talent into your organization, you'd be very surprised that a lot of talent that want to be associated with companies that have, you know, green agendas and sustainability programs, you know, proper ones. You know, these are, and customers want to work with companies that are in this, have plans and visions for the future around what's right around climate change, and you know, programs for government, and how we sort of look at the impact on our environment. So it's becoming a much wider conversation than just, you know, how can we get our act in order, because the only way we'll get our act in order is when everyone else that's associated with it are aligned, because it's going to be a collective response to getting to where we want to get to, and not just doing it tomorrow.
I tend to agree with you fully. As a father of a 17 and 11-year-old, when your 11-year-old comes to you and asks you what your view is on unconscious bias, you know that there's a change coming about with regard to the language that they're using. So what you say, both is very clear, understood. Measuring. How do you demonstrate the ESG credentials? And ESG obviously is environmental, sustainable, as a part of the overall governance. How does one demonstrate that, Maurice? If I could ask you, how do you demonstrate, or how are you going to, over the next decade, demonstrate that?
Okay, so you've got, it's environmental, social, and governance. So I think on the S and the G part, you know, we're quite advanced as an organization. I mean, if you, I won't go into all details around S and G, but I mean, social, we've got our all diversity, inclusion, and belonging components with our workforce, and there's a huge amount going on internally around, you know, the whole balance of our organization right across the whole spectrum of diversity. Governance, you know, we're producing our ESG report every year. It's up on the website for everyone to see, to download. It's verified externally by 4 or 5 different organizations to ensure that we're compliant, and that it's not us just, you know, telling people what we're doing. So that stuff is there to be seen. I suppose on the environmental part, this is where this is my role in EMEA gets a bit more meatier, and we're back to the sustainability program. So, but I mean, for me, if you look at it in that context, we're probably really looking at the impact on the communities and the areas in which we have located our facilities, and how do we work with those communities, and how do we give back to those communities in a sustainable way, and that's environmentally friendly. So very broadly speaking, that's sort of you know, the areas I'll be concentrating on when I look on the E part of the ESG. And then as regards the reporting piece, we're already doing that. We've been doing that for a number of years.
It's interesting. We probably never envisaged in 2020 that the effects of children and the younger generation on the way the world is right now. But it is no doubt, and I know that you're a father yourself of young kids, is that this word purpose is everywhere. It's everywhere. I didn't know what the word was up to 5 years ago, but you and I, and maybe Emma, if I could throw you into this discussion, we were happy enough to get a job with a few quid for a few pints on a Friday. Now we have, genuinely, it's a real thing. It's a purpose, seems to be a very real thing for people in talent.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly from, you know, if you take a certain demographic, that we look at employing 100%. I'd say it's in all of our interviews. Is culture and where are we headed with our business? What's our policy going to be around remote working? What are my opportunities to grow my career? But I mean, the purpose, the culture, I would say now form probably 70 or 80% of an interview conversation.
This internet thing gives the tools to this talent to tell them that they could get a job somewhere else, whereas back in our day, you'd be happy to get a job. Emma.
Thankfully, things have changed.
Thankfully. Emma, so
yes, Garry.
Lots of words that the audience, obviously, that would be listening to this, maybe either a data community or a center community, but as Maurice has highlighted now, without purpose and E and S and G, circular economy. This is a thing that is everywhere also. And there's a number of questions that have come in. For example, does the panel believe that there seem to be, will there be constraints, in your opinion, on raw materials for the building of the infrastructure?
Usually, I think it's a really good question, because actually usually the concerns about energy, will there be enough energy to run all this stuff? Will we have to go and live in caves and eat bugs because it's all been used up? So it's really good to see a question on raw materials. I think from my perspective, in terms of construction, I have less concern than in terms of the IT. So where we see real constraints on raw materials is within the IT. And if you look, actually, the Commission publishes a list of critical raw materials. And if you go down the list, tantalum, tungsten, vanadium, lithium, titanium, strontium, cobalt, the lot. There's a whole list of them, and those are the things that will constrain sort of IT manufacturing. So I'd say it's more at the device end than at the infrastructure end. Although, having said that, during COVID-19, we had the biggest shortage we had, which was a genuine supply shortage, was actually plasterboard. We weren't expecting that, for sure. So gypsum was a thing we lacked. But yes, and I think the big cloud providers, to my understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that they tend to have developing cloud, more closed loop manufacturing processes and remanufacturing for their servers. So what one hopes is that you then don't have what we call a grey disposal supply chain where we lose stuff. And I know that there's a huge amount of regulatory legislative focus on waste and how we ensure that we don't lose those raw materials. But I don't think that's solved yet. So I suspect that that's where the challenge would lie, rather than actually the infrastructure.
Okay, and that obviously either drives to sourcing new innovative ways of replacing what may be, or to our topic mainly this morning is more sustainable products. And I hear in dispatches, and we haven't discussed this on this, but yesterday I listened to very interesting discussion around photonic chips, where electrons are not the main driver of the data around the chip. It's light, which doesn't emit heat. So, 20 years time, my sense is that you're going to see more photonics and this other thing called synthetic data and holograms and stuff, all about light. So, when we look back and think that the iPhone is only 15 years old, and we think where we've come from then, look forward 15 years, who knows what new technologies will be used. We have exactly 180 seconds left, because Zoom tells me it's wonderful, because we're cheap and we only have the free version. So we're going to get kicked out in 3 minutes. So I'm going to ask both of you just to, based on sort of your own experiences right now and listening and hearing the narratives around data and centers, 10 years, great 10 years. obviously, of growth. Great 10 years of trying, I guess, to educate a lot of people about the value of data. What would you like to say to yourself now that you'll know in 10 years, if that makes any sense at all, Emma? I don't think it does, but just...
I can tell you, yeah. I'd say if you think you've explained it once, you're going to need to explain it again and again and again. So don't think you've solved it and everyone understands it because you've explained it once. We have to keep explaining it, and we're going to have to continue to.
Isn't that a wonderful way? Somebody also said to me yesterday that the likes of during the automobile explosion in the 1910s, the people that were shoeing horses weren't exactly promoting cars. So you have this dynamic going on also. Maurice, you're looking back to 2020, and you're in 2030. What do you think you would have liked to have told yourself?
I think we've got a really good stab at being able to get to this carbon neutral position. I think there's a real buy-in from Europe, as you know, Gary. There's great buy-in from a lot of the big organizations and players. So, I feel now that there's genuine, push and power behind, and investment that's going to be needed to get to that point. And I think if you think of, the last 10 years and the effort that's been made to position the industry in a certain way, I think there's a huge opportunity for us now to position ourselves in a slightly different way that's going to do an awful lot of good.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. Emma, I have to commend all of us for not mentioning Brexit once.
Thank you.
But now I have. Maurice, the very best of luck in your current and next role within Equinix. And as always, it's great to be surrounded by people who actually have genuine experience-based knowledge. So thank you both for your time last week and also today. Thank you so much.
Welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.